Captain Jake Harrison pressed his face against the cold metal of the viewport and stared out at the endless red desert of Mars. The planet stretched before him like a giant rust-colored ocean, broken only by dark rocks and deep valleys that disappeared into shadow. He had seen Mars many times before, but today it looked different. Today it looked angry. Jake pulled back from the window and rubbed his tired eyes. 3 months had passed since he took command of the UES Frontier, and he still woke up every morning thinking about his old crew. The crew that died on Titan because he made a stupid mistake. The crew that trusted him to bring them home safe. He remembered the promise he made at their funeral, standing in the cold rain outside the military cemetery, watching 12 coffins disappear into the ground. He swore he would never let it happen again. Never again would his overconfidence get people killed. Never again would he lead a crew into a situation they could not escape from. The Frontier was supposed to be his second chance. The ship was newer and faster than his old command. The crew was smaller, but more skilled. The missions were supposed to be simple supply runs between Mars and the outer colonies. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that could go wrong. Jake walked through the narrow hallways of his ship, checking on his crew. In the engine room, he found Lisa Wong bent over a control panel, her short black hair falling across her face as she worked. Lisa was the best engineer he had ever served with. She could fix anything and make it work better than when it was new. "How are we looking, Lisa?" Jake asked. Lisa looked up and smiled. "All systems green, Captain. The new plasma drives are running smooth as silk. We should reach the Olympus mining station right on schedule." Jake nodded and continued his rounds. In the medical bay, he found Tom Bradley organizing supplies. Tom was a big man with gentle hands and a calm voice that could make anyone feel better. He had served as a field medic in 3 different wars before joining the merchant fleet. "Everything ready, Doc?" Jake asked. "Always am, Captain," Tom replied. "Though I hope this run is as boring as the last one. I like it when nobody needs my services." The communication center was Jake's next stop. Rachel Stone sat at her station, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail as she monitored radio traffic from across the solar system. Rachel had grown up on a farm in Kansas but dreamed of traveling to the stars. She was only 24 years old, but she could work communication equipment like it was part of her own body. "Any interesting chatter today, Rachel?" Jake asked. "Just the usual cargo schedules and weather reports, Captain," Rachel said. "Though, there is a dust storm forming near the equator. Nothing we need to worry about, but the Weather Service is keeping an eye on it." Jake felt a small chill run down his spine. Dust storms on Mars could be dangerous, but they usually gave plenty of warning. The Frontier had excellent weather detection systems. They would see any danger coming from miles away. The supply run to Olympus Mining Station should have been routine. Jake had made the trip dozens of times in other ships. The mining station sat on the slopes of Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. The miners there pulled rare metals from the volcanic rock and shipped them back to Earth. They needed regular deliveries of food, medicine, and equipment to keep working. The Frontier carried enough supplies to keep the station running for 3 months. The cargo hold was packed with everything from fresh vegetables grown in the hydroponic farms of Ceres to replacement parts for the mining equipment. It was valuable cargo, but not dangerous. Nothing that could explode or leak or cause problems. Jake returned to the bridge and settled into his command chair. Through the main view screen, he could see Mars growing larger as they approached. The red planet filled more and more of the screen, showing the scars of ancient impacts and the deep channels carved by rivers that dried up billions of years ago. "Beginning approach to Mars orbital space," announced his pilot, Mike Davis. Mike had been flying ships for 15 years and knew the Mars routes better than anyone. His steady hands and quick reflexes had gotten them out of trouble more than once. "Looking good, Mike," Jake said. "Take us in nice and easy." The first sign of trouble came from Rachel at the communication station. "Captain, I'm getting some strange readings from the weather satellites. That dust storm near the equator is moving faster than predicted." Jake frowned. "How much faster?" "A lot faster, sir. It's already covered twice as much ground as the computer models said it would, and it's heading in our direction." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Dust storms on Mars could be massive, covering entire continents and lasting for months. They could block out the sun and create electrical interference that made navigation almost impossible. But they moved slowly, giving ships plenty of time to change course or find shelter. "Mike, can we adjust our approach to avoid the storm?" Jake asked. Mike studied his navigation display. "I can try, Captain, but our options are limited. We're already committed to this trajectory, and changing course now would use a lot of fuel." Jake weighed his options. They could turn around and return to Ceres, but that would delay the supply delivery by weeks. The miners at Olympus Station were counting on them. Or they could try to race the storm and reach the station before it arrived. "How long until we reach Olympus Station?" Jake asked. 4 hours at current speed," Mike replied. "And how long until the storm reaches the station?" Rachel checked her instruments. "The computers say 6 hours, but given how wrong they were about the storm's speed, I would not count on that." Jake made his decision. "We go for it. Push the engines to maximum safe speed. We can beat this storm." It was exactly the kind of decision he had promised himself he would never make again. The kind of overconfident choice that had killed his last crew. But the miners needed those supplies, and Jake convinced himself that the frontier was fast enough and modern enough to handle whatever Mars could throw at them. He was wrong. The storm caught them 2 hours later, moving 3 times faster than any dust storm in recorded history. One moment they were flying through clear Martian sky, and the next they were surrounded by a wall of red dust so thick it blocked out the sun. The ship's sensors failed almost immediately, overwhelmed by the electrical interference from billions of particles rubbing against each other in the wind. "I can't see anything," Mike shouted over the growing noise of the storm. "Navigation is completely blind." "Emergency landing protocols," Jake ordered, but he knew it was too late. The automated systems took control of the ship, searching for a safe place to land in the chaos of the storm. The frontier bucked and rolled like a wild horse as the Martian wind grabbed it and threw it around the sky. When they finally crashed, it was in the worst possible place. The Chrysa Basin sand pits, where the sand was so fine and deep that it could swallow a ship whole. Jake felt the frontier settle into the red sand with a sickening lurch, and he knew immediately that they were in serious trouble. Through the storm, he could hear the ship's hull creaking as they sank deeper into the shifting sand. His promise echoed in his mind like a curse. He had sworn he would never get bogged down again, and now here he was, trapped in the worst sandpit on Mars with 12 lives depending on him to find a way out. The storm raged outside, and Jake Harrison realized that some promises were harder to keep than others. High above the red surface of Mars, Commander Veltar stood on the bridge of his invisible ship and watched the human vessel disappear into the dust storm. The Kethvar had been observing this solar system for many cycles, documenting the strange behavior of the species that called itself humanity. Veltar was tall and thin, with gray skin that shifted color based on his mood. Right now it showed the pale blue of mild curiosity. His large black eyes could see across many different light spectrums, allowing him to track the human ship even through the thick dust that covered half the planet below. "Commander," said his science officer, Nethka, "the human vessel has made an emergency landing in the Chrysa Basin." Veltar's skin shifted to a darker blue that meant interest. "The sandpits?" "Yes, Commander." "Sector 7, grid reference 449. Every member of the bridge crew turned to look at their commander. The Chrysa Basin sandpits were famous throughout this part of the galaxy, though not for good reasons. The Kethvar had been studying Mars for over 200 Earth years, and in that time they had watched 6 different species crash in those same deadly sands. None had ever escaped. The sand pits were a natural trap created by millions of years of wind and chemical reactions. The sand was not ordinary sand like humans might find on their home world. It was made of tiny particles of iron oxide mixed with rare minerals that created strange magnetic fields. These fields interfered with most types of engines and navigation systems. But the real danger was how the sand behaved. It looked solid from above, but it was actually more like a liquid that had been frozen in time. When something heavy landed on it, the sand would slowly swallow it up. The more the trapped object struggled, the faster it sank. Veltar had watched a Zelnari cruiser disappear completely in just 4 days. The Zelnari were excellent engineers, much better than humans, but their ship had vanished beneath the red sand like it had never existed. The Gorthani had lasted 6 days before their massive cargo hauler was completely buried. Even the Kethvar themselves avoided the sand pits. They had lost a research vessel there 50 years ago, along with a crew of 23 scientists. How long do we estimate before the human ship is completely submerged? Veltar asked. Nethka checked her instruments. Based on the ship's mass and the local sand density, no more than 72 hours. Probably less. Veltar nodded slowly. It was what he expected. The human ship was smaller than most of the vessels that had been lost in the sand pits, but it was also denser. The heavy metals in its hull would make it sink faster than usual. "Are they sending distress signals?" he asked. "Yes, Commander. Multiple frequencies, very basic transmission protocols. They appear to be trying to contact other human settlements in this system. Any response? Nothing yet. The dust storm is interfering with long-range communications. Even if their signals get through, the nearest human colony is at least 4 days away by fast ship." Veltar walked to the large viewing screen that dominated the front of the bridge. Mars filled the display, its red surface scarred by ancient craters and deep valleys. The dust storm showed as a massive swirl of brown and yellow clouds that covered nearly a quarter of the planet. Somewhere in that storm, 12 humans were trapped in a ship that was slowly sinking into quicksand. It should have been just another routine observation for his mission log. Species number 47, unsuccessful attempt at interplanetary colonization, terminated by environmental hazards. The Kethvar had been watching primitive species try to spread beyond their home worlds for thousands of years. Most failed within a few generations. Only a handful ever made it past their own solar system. But something about these humans was different. Veltar had been studying them for 3 years now, ever since they first appeared on Mars with their crude mining operations. Most species that reached this stage of development followed predictable patterns. They would establish a few colonies, exploit the easy resources, then either destroy themselves in wars or give up when the challenges became too difficult. Humans did neither. When their first colony ships crashed, they built better ones. When their mining equipment failed in the Martian environment, they redesigned it. When dust storms destroyed their communication networks, they found new ways to stay in contact. They seemed to treat every failure as a learning experience rather than a reason to quit. "Commander," Nethka said, "I am receiving some interesting data from the human ship." "What kind of data?" "Their communication chatter. Instead of distress, calls or prayers to their gods, they appear to be conducting technical discussions. Engineering calculations, resource inventories, repair procedures." Veltar's skin shifted to a deeper blue that indicated strong curiosity. "They are trying to solve their problem instead of waiting for rescue." "It appears so, Commander. I am also detecting increased power usage in their fabrication systems and mining equipment. This was unusual. Most species in similar situations would either panic or accept their fate. Some would try to send messages to their loved ones. Others would perform religious ceremonies or attempt to preserve their cultural records for future discovery. Very few would immediately begin working on engineering solutions. Veltar had studied the official reports on all 6 previous species that had been lost in the sandpits. The Zelnari had spent their final days arguing among themselves about who was to blame for the crash. The Gorthani had used their last hours to compose epic poems about their heroic journey. The Seklari had built an elaborate shrine to their ancestors and waited for death with dignity and acceptance, all very reasonable responses to an impossible situation. But the humans seemed to be ignoring the fact that their situation was impossible. Nethica, what do our historical records show about species that have escaped from similar trap environments? The science officer consulted her database. None, Commander. In 4,000 years of galactic observation, no species has ever escaped from a Class 5 gravitational sand trap. And yet the humans are behaving as if escape were possible. Yes, Commander. Quite illogical. Veltar studied the swirling dust storm on the screen below. Somewhere in that chaos, a small group of humans was refusing to accept the inevitable. They were trapped in a situation that had killed 6 other species, using technology that was primitive compared to those previous victims, facing environmental conditions that should have overwhelmed their life support systems hours ago. And instead of giving up, they were working. Set up continuous monitoring of the human vessel, Veltar ordered. I want detailed scans of all their activities. Record everything. Yes, Commander. Should I prepare the standard report for species termination? Veltar considered this. The standard procedure was to observe until the species went extinct, then file a report documenting their technological level and the cause of their failure. The data would be added to the great database that helped the Kethvar understand how intelligent life developed and died throughout the galaxy. But something told him this situation might be different. Not yet, he said. Let us see what these humans do next. His skin had shifted to a bright blue that his crew recognized as fascination. In all his years of observing primitive species, Veltar had never felt quite this interested in watching how a story would end. Below them, the dust storm continued to rage, and somewhere in its heart, 12 humans were about to attempt something that every expert in the galaxy would consider completely impossible. Veltar found himself hoping they would succeed. Jake Harrison stood in the cargo hold of the Frontier and felt the ship sink another inch into the Martian sand. The metal floor beneath his feet groaned under the stress, and he could hear sand grinding against the hull like thousands of tiny fingers trying to pull them deeper underground. It had been 6 hours since the crash, and every attempt to lift off had only made things worse. The ship's engines were powerful enough to break free from normal gravity, but the sand was not normal. Every time they fired the thrusters, the Frontier just buried itself deeper into the red quicksand that surrounded them. Captain, Lisa Wong, called from her position near the engine controls. I've been running tests on the sand composition. This stuff is not like anything we've seen before. Jake walked over to where Lisa was studying readings on her portable scanner. The young engineer had been working non-stop since the crash, trying to understand exactly what they were dealing with. Her uniform was stained with sweat and engine grease, but her eyes were bright with the kind of focus that Jake had learned to trust completely. What did you find? Jake asked. Lisa pointed to the scanner display. The sand particles are coated with iron oxide, but that's not the weird part. There are also traces of some kind of magnetic mineral I've never seen before. When our engines fire, the heat and electromagnetic fields cause the sand to become more liquid. We're literally making our own trap worse every time we try to escape. Jake felt his heart sink. So the engines won't work? Not the way we're using them now, Lisa said. But I've been thinking, what if we don't try to fight the sand? What if we use it instead? Jake raised an eyebrow. Use it how? Lisa pulled out a piece of paper and started sketching quickly. Back home in Louisiana, I grew up near the bayous. When cars got stuck in the mud, sometimes the best way to get out was to build a road. My grandfather used to say that if you can't go through something, you go around it, and if you can't go around it, you go over it. She showed Jake her rough drawing. It looked like a spiral ramp leading up from the bottom of a pit. "You want to build a road out of sand?" Jake asked. "Not exactly sand," Lisa said with a grin. "Glass. The ship's mining laser array is designed to cut through solid rock. If we focus the beams correctly, we can heat the sand to over 3,000 degrees. At that temperature, all these mineral particles will fuse together into a solid glass surface." Jake stared at the drawing. It was crazy. It was also the first plan anyone had come up with that might actually work. "How long would it take?" he asked. "To build a spiral ramp big enough for the ship to drive up? Maybe 48 hours of continuous work. Maybe more." "Drive up?" "Lisa, this ship doesn't have wheels." Lisa's grin got wider. "No, but it has landing. Thrusters positioned around the hull. If we modify the thrust patterns and use them like jets, we can make the ship move forward instead of just up. It won't be pretty, but it should work." Jake looked around the cargo hold at his crew. They were all listening to Lisa's explanation with the kind of desperate hope that came from realizing you might not die today after all. But Jake also saw the exhaustion in their faces. They had been working for hours in the heat and stress of their buried ship. "People," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We have a plan. It's going to be hard work, and there's no guarantee it will succeed, but it's the best chance we have." Tom Bradley stepped forward. The big medic had been quietly checking on everyone's health since the crash. "Captain, we need to talk about the heat problem. The ship's cooling systems weren't designed for this kind of environment. If we're going to be running high energy equipment for 2 days straight, people are going to start dropping from heat exhaustion. What do you recommend, Doc?" "We work in shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, and we rig up some kind of additional cooling system using whatever we can find in the cargo hold." Rachel Stone looked up from her communication station. "Captain, I've been trying to reach other human ships, but the sand is interfering with our signals. However, I think I can boost our transmission power by rerouting energy from non-essential systems." "Do it," Jake said. "Even if we succeed in getting out of here, it would be nice to have backup on the way." Jake assigned work teams and schedules. Lisa would lead the engineering crew in modifying the mining lasers and setting up the glass-making operation. Tom would work on cooling systems and keep everyone healthy. Rachel would maintain communications and help with technical calculations. The rest of the crew would rotate between different jobs as needed. The work began immediately. Lisa and her team crawled through the ship's maintenance tunnels, rerouting power cables and reprogramming the mining laser controls. The lasers had been designed to cut precise holes in asteroid rock, but Lisa was modifying them to spread their heat over much larger areas. Meanwhile, Tom was busy in the cargo hold, building improvised cooling systems from spare parts. He took apart atmospheric processors and cargo containers, using their heat exchangers and cooling coils to create portable air conditioning units. It was makeshift engineering at its finest, held together with spare wire and sheer determination. Rachel worked at her station, trying to punch radio signals through the electromagnetic interference created by the sand around them. She discovered that certain frequencies could penetrate better than others, and she began sending out coded distress messages that included their exact position and the nature of their predicament. The first test of the glass-making system came 12 hours after the crash. Lisa had set up the mining lasers to focus on a small area of sand just outside the ship's hull. Jake and the crew gathered around the viewports to watch. "Firing laser array in 3, 2, 1, Lisa announced. The red sand outside suddenly glowed. Bright orange, then white hot. Steam and strange-colored smoke rose from the heated area as the mineral particles began to melt and flow together. After 30 seconds, Lisa shut off the lasers. "Now we wait for it to cool," she said. 20 minutes later, they had their first piece of Martian glass. It was rough and uneven, but it was solid. A person could walk on it without sinking into the sand below. "It works," Jake said, feeling hope rise in his chest for the first time since the crash. "It works," Lisa agreed. Now we just need to make about 10,000 more pieces just like it, arrange them in a perfect spiral ramp, and hope the ship can actually drive up it without falling apart. Jake looked around at his crew. They were tired, scared, and facing an enormous challenge. But they were also smiling. For the first time since the crash, they had a real plan. It was a crazy plan that had never been tried before, but it was theirs. "All right, people," Jake said. "Let's build ourselves a road to freedom." Outside the ship, the Martian sand continued to shift and settle, trying to pull the frontier deeper into its deadly embrace. But inside the ship, 12 humans were working on something that would change everything. They were building the impossible, one piece of glass at a time. The next 48 hours aboard the UES Frontier became a test of human endurance that no training manual had ever prepared them for. Jake Harrison watched his crew work in conditions that should have broken them, but instead seemed to make them stronger. Lisa Wong had not slept more than 2 hours at a time since they started the Glass Road project. She moved through the ship like a woman possessed, fine-tuning laser arrays, calculating heat dispersal patterns, and solving problems that had never existed before. Her hands were burned from handling hot metal components, and her eyes were red from staring at computer screens, but she never stopped working. "The third section is ready for testing," Lisa announced over the ship's communication system. "Jake, you need to see this." Jake made his way to the observation deck where Lisa had set up a monitoring station. Through the reinforced windows, he could see their progress. What had started as a small patch of melted sand had grown into a genuine road. The glass surface spiraled up from the bottom of the sandpit like a giant corkscrew, each section carefully designed to support the weight of their ship. "How many sections do we have completed?" Jake asked. 27 out of about 60, Lisa replied. "We're making better time than I expected. The crew is getting faster at the process." Jake looked down at the work area where Tom Bradley was directing a team in moving equipment. The big medic had turned into something like a construction foreman, organizing the physical labor while still maintaining his medical duties. He had rigged up a cooling system using cargo container refrigeration units and flexible ducting that kept the work areas just barely tolerable. "How is everyone holding up?" Jake asked. "Better than they should be," Lisa said. "Tom's cooling system is working miracles, and Rachel figured out how to redirect power from non-essential systems to keep everything running. We're using 30% more energy than the ship was designed for, but the reactors are holding steady." Through another window, Jake could see Rachel Stone at her improvised command center. She had taken over the ship's galley and turned it into a coordination hub for their entire operation. Multiple computer screens showed structural diagrams, power consumption charts, and communication logs. Rachel was somehow managing to maintain radio contact with 3 different human outposts while running complex engineering calculations. "Captain," Rachel's voice came through the intercom, "I'm getting responses from Mars Colony Alpha and Olympus Mining Station. They're both sending rescue ships, but the fastest one won't arrive for another 36 hours. "Will we be done by then?" Jake asked Lisa. Lisa checked her calculations. "If we maintain current progress, yes, but there's no room for errors or equipment failures." Jake nodded and continued his inspection tour. In the engine room, he found crew members who had been cargo handlers just days ago now performing precision electronics work. They were learning to calibrate mining lasers, adjust cooling systems, and monitor structural stress in real time. The transformation was remarkable. People were doing jobs they had never trained for, using equipment in ways it was never designed for, solving problems that no human had ever faced before. And somehow, it was working. Mike Davis, their pilot, had become an expert in glass road construction. He was outside the ship in an environment suit, using handheld tools to smooth rough spots in their glass pathway and reinforce weak sections. His steady hands that usually guided them through space were now shaping their escape route one piece at a time. "The curve angle on Section 15 needs adjustment," Mike reported over the radio. "The grade is too steep for our thrust-to-weight ratio." "Understood," Lisa replied. "We'll recut that section after the next cooling cycle." Jake realized that his crew was no longer just following orders or completing assigned tasks. They were thinking ahead, anticipating problems, and developing solutions independently. The crisis had transformed them from a collection of specialists into something more like a single organism focused on survival. But the real test came on the second day when their first major equipment failure occurred. "Captain to engineering." Lisa's voice came over the intercom, and Jake could hear the stress in it. "We have a problem." Jake rushed to the engine room, where he found Lisa staring at a control panel showing red warning lights. "What happened?" "Primary. Laser array overheated," Lisa explained. "The focusing crystal cracked under the thermal stress. We can't continue the glass-making process without it." Jake felt his stomach drop. They were more than halfway done with their escape route, but without the mining lasers, they could not complete it. "How long to repair it?" "That's the problem," Lisa said. "We don't have a replacement crystal. The spares were damaged in the crash." For a moment, the engine room was completely silent. Jake could hear the ship settling deeper into the sand with tiny creaking sounds. Every hour they delayed meant sinking further into the trap. Then Tom Bradley spoke up from the corner where he had been checking equipment. "What if we don't need to replace it? What if we can fix it?" Lisa shook her head. "Tom, these crystals are grown in zero-gravity factories. You can't just glue them back together." "No," Tom said slowly, "but you can weld them." He walked over to a storage cabinet and pulled out his medical laser scalpel. "I use this for microsurgery. It operates at exactly the right frequency to fuse crystal matrices without creating structural weaknesses. I've repaired damaged bone implants with similar techniques." Lisa stared at the medical device. "That's completely insane. You're talking about performing surgery on a mining laser using a medical tool." "Yes," Tom said with a grin. "Insane enough that it might work. The crystal repair took 6 hours of the most delicate work any of them had ever attempted." Tom worked with the steady hands of a surgeon while Lisa guided him through the technical requirements of laser crystal construction. Rachel monitored power levels and structural integrity. Jake and the rest of the crew held their breath and tried not to disturb the concentration of their improvised repair team. When they finally tested the repaired laser array, it worked perfectly. Better than perfectly, actually. Tom's surgical precision had eliminated tiny flaws in the original crystal that the factory had missed. "Well," Jake said as he watched their glass road construction resume, "I guess we can add crystal surgery to our list of new skills." Above them, the Martian sky was beginning to clear as the dust storm finally moved on. They could see stars again, and somewhere among those stars, Commander Veltar was watching their progress with growing amazement. The humans were not just surviving an impossible situation, they were treating it like a normal engineering problem, and solving it with the kind of practical creativity that the galaxy had never seen before. Jake looked around at his crew as they returned to work. They were tired, dirty, and pushed beyond their limits. They were also smiling. For the first time since his disaster on Titan, Jake began to understand something important about leadership. His old promise had been about avoiding failure. But maybe the better promise was about what to do when failure happened anyway. Maybe the real measure of a captain was not whether he could prevent problems, but whether he could help his crew turn problems into solutions. The glass road continued to grow, spiraling upward toward freedom, one impossible section at a time. The morning of the third day on Mars brought a strange kind of silence to the UES frontier. The dust storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear sky that showed the red planet in all its harsh beauty. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge looking out at their completed glass road, and he felt a mixture of pride and terror that made his hands shake. The spiral pathway gleamed in the early Martian sunlight like a giant piece of art. 63 sections of fused sandglass wound their way up from the bottom of the sandpit to the surface above. It was beautiful, impossible, and completely untested with a real spaceship. All systems are ready for the ascent attempt, Lisa Wong reported from her engineering station. She had finally gotten 4 hours of sleep and looked almost human again, though her hands were still bandaged from burns sustained during the construction work. Structural integrity checks complete, Rachel Stone announced from her position at the improvised command center. The glass road can support our weight, but there's not much safety margin. We get one chance at this. Jake nodded and activated the ship-wide communication system. All hands, this is the captain. We are beginning our escape attempt. Everyone needs to be strapped in and ready for a rough ride. This ship was never designed to drive up a mountain, so we're all going to learn something new today. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. The Frontier would use its landing thrusters as makeshift propulsion, pushing the ship forward along the glass road like a rocket-powered sled. Mike Davis had spent hours calculating thrust angles and power settings, but there were too many variables to be certain of anything. Beginning preliminary thrust test, Mike announced from the pilot's seat. The ship vibrated as the landing thrusters fired in a pattern that pushed them forward instead of up. The Frontier lurched slightly and began to move along the first section of Glass Road. Through the viewports, Jake could see the red sand falling away below them as they climbed higher. Thrust is stable, Mike reported. Road surface is holding, beginning Section 2. The second section was where they encountered their first problem. The glass surface had developed a small crack during the cooling process, and when the ship's weight hit it, the crack spread rapidly across the entire width of the road. "Section 2 is failing," Rachel shouted as warning alarms filled the bridge. "Structural collapse in progress." Jake felt the ship tilt as the glass gave way beneath them. For a moment, it seemed like they would fall back into the sandpit and have to start over. But Tom Bradley's cooling system had done its job perfectly. The section held together just long enough for them to reach Section 3. "We're through," Mike said with relief in his voice. "Section 3 is solid." The ascent continued, but each section brought new challenges. The ship's hull temperature began to climb as the thrusters worked harder than they were designed to. Strange electromagnetic effects from the sand below interfered with their navigation systems, forcing Mike to steer by visual reference alone. On Section 15, the one they had rebuilt after Mike's adjustment, they encountered a problem nobody had anticipated. The angle was perfect for their thrust-to-weight ratio, but it was too steep for their cargo to stay secure. Jake could hear equipment sliding around in the cargo hold as the ship climbed at an angle that made everyone feel like they were riding in an elevator that was moving sideways. "Tom, get down to cargo and secure anything that's loose," Jake ordered. "If something heavy breaks free, it could shift our center of gravity and send us off the road." Tom unbuckled from his medical station and made his way through the ship, using handholds and magnetic boots to move safely in the tilted environment. Through the intercom, they could hear him wrestling with cargo containers and emergency equipment that had come loose from their restraints. "Cargo is secure," Tom finally reported. "But, Captain, we have another problem. The cooling system is being pushed beyond its limits. Internal temperature is rising faster than we can compensate." Jake checked the environmental readings on his display. The numbers were not good. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes before people start passing out from heat exhaustion," Tom replied. Jake looked at their progress indicator. They had completed 38 sections out of 63. At their current rate, they needed at least 30 more minutes to reach the top. "Lisa, can we increase thrust and move faster?" Jake asked. "Not safely," Lisa replied. "If we push the thrusters any harder, we risk damaging them. And if they fail while we're on the road, we'll roll backward into the pit." Jake made a decision that went against every safety protocol he had ever learned. Cut power to everything except life support and propulsion. Lights, computers, communications, everything. All available energy goes to Tom's cooling system. "Captain," Rachel protested, "if we cut communications, we lose contact with the rescue ships. And if something goes wrong, we won't be able to call for help." If we don't stay conscious, none of that will matter, Jake replied. The ship went dark except for emergency lighting. The constant hum of electronics faded to almost nothing, but the cooling system began working more efficiently, and the internal temperature stabilized. They climbed in darkness and near silence, with only the sound of the thrusters and the occasional creak of metal under stress. Mike navigated by looking out the viewport at the glass road ahead, using techniques that spaceship pilots had never needed to learn. Section 45 brought them to the steepest part of the spiral, where the road curved up at an angle that made the ship feel like it was climbing a wall. Jake could see the strain on Mike's face as he fought to keep them centered on the narrow glass pathway. "I can see the top," Mike announced when they reached Section 55. "Just 8 more sections to go." But Section 57 almost ended everything. A piece of glass that had been weakened by thermal stress chose that moment to crack completely. The ship lurched to one side as the road surface gave way beneath their left landing thruster. For a terrifying moment, the Frontier balanced on the edge of disaster. Half the ship was still on solid glass, but the other half was hanging over empty space with nothing but sand far below. "Cut left thruster," Jake ordered. "All power to right side thrusters. Push us back onto the road." Mike's hands flew over the controls, redirecting thrust to compensate for their precarious position. The ship groaned and tilted further, but slowly began to swing back toward the center of the glass pathway. "Come on," Lisa whispered from her station. "Come on, you beautiful piece of junk." The Frontier settled back onto solid glass with an impact that rattled every bolt and rivet in the hull. But they were back on the road, and they were still climbing. Sections 58, 59, and 60 passed without major incident. When they reached Section 61, Jake could see level ground ahead of them. Real, solid Martian bedrock. That had never been a sandpit. "Section 63, Mike announced. "We're off the glass road and onto stable surface." Jake felt the ship settle onto normal ground for the first time in 3 days. The gentle vibration of engines at rest was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "All stop," he ordered. "We made it!" The bridge erupted in cheers and applause. Lisa was crying with relief. Tom was laughing like a man who had just won the lottery. Rachel was already powering up the communication systems to announce their success to the rescue ships that were still hours away. But Jake just sat in his captain's chair and looked back at the glass road spiraling down into the sandpit they had escaped. Somewhere up in orbit, he knew that alien observers had watched the entire process. He wondered what they thought of a species that would spend 3 days building the impossible just to avoid giving up. The UES Frontier had made it out of the worst trap on Mars through nothing but human stubbornness and the refusal to accept that some problems could not be solved. Jake Harrison had learned something important about promises, about leadership, and about the kind of species humanity really was. They were the kind of people who built roads out of sand and turned disasters into engineering challenges. And that was exactly the kind of people the galaxy needed. 3 days after their escape from the Christ Basin sand pits, Jake Harrison stood in the observation lounge of the UES Frontier and watched the red surface of Mars slowly disappear below them. The planet looked peaceful from orbit, showing no sign of the deadly trap that had nearly claimed his ship and crew. The rescue vessels had arrived just as they were finishing their post-escape system checks. Captain Sarah Mitchell of the cargo hauler New Houston had been the first to reach them, and Jake would never forget the look of amazement on her face when she realized what they had accomplished. "You built a road out of what?" she had asked, during their first communication. "Glass," Jake had replied. "We melted sand into glass and built a spiral road out of the sand pit." There had been a long silence before Sarah responded. "Jake, I've been flying Mars routes for 15 years. 6 ships have been lost in those sand pits. Nobody has ever gotten out." "Well," Jake had said, looking around at his exhausted but proud crew, "I guess we're the first." Now, as they headed back towards Ceres Station for repairs and resupply, Jake was still processing everything that had happened. The official reports would describe their escape in technical terms: innovative use of mining equipment, creative problem-solving under extreme conditions, successful improvisation of untested procedures. But Jake knew the real story was much simpler. 12 humans had refused to die quietly. Lisa Wong approached him in the observation lounge, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking more rested than she had in days. Her hands were still bandaged, but she was already sketching improvements to their glass road technique on a digital tablet. "Thought you might want some caffeine," she said, handing Jake one of the cups. "Thanks," Jake replied. "What are you working on now?" Lisa grinned and showed him her tablet. "I'm writing up a technical manual for emergency glass road construction. I figure if we could do it with mining lasers and spare parts, other ships should be able to do it too with the right preparation." Jake studied her diagrams. They were detailed and practical, covering everything from sand composition analysis to thrust angle calculations. "You really think other crews could replicate what we did?" "With proper planning and equipment, absolutely," Lisa said. "The hard part was figuring it out under pressure. Now that we know it works, it becomes just another emergency procedure." Jake shook his head in amazement. Only Lisa would look at their desperate escape attempt and see it as a reproducible engineering solution. Tom Bradley joined them at the observation window, followed by Rachel Stone and Mike Davis. The entire senior Eddie crew had developed a habit of gathering here during their off-duty hours, drawn together by what they had shared in the sandpits. "Any word from Mars Control about our glass road?" Tom asked. Rachel nodded. "They're sending a survey team to study it. Apparently, some university researchers want to examine the structural properties of fused Martian sand. They think it might have applications for construction projects." "Great," Mike said with a laugh. "We accidentally invented a new building material while trying not to die." Jake looked around at his crew and felt something he had not experienced since the disaster on Titan: pride. Not the dangerous overconfidence that had gotten his last crew killed, but the quiet satisfaction of working with people who could turn impossible situations into routine problems. "I need to tell you all something," Jake said. "After what happened on Titan, I made a promise to myself. I swore I would never let overconfidence put my crew in danger again. I promised I would never get bogged down in situations we couldn't escape from." The crew listened quietly. They all knew about Titan, though Jake had never talked about it in detail. "But I realized something while we were building that road," Jake continued. "Fear-based promises are worthless. Promising to avoid problems doesn't make you a better leader. It just makes you paralyzed." He paused and looked out at the stars beyond Mars. Somewhere out there, alien civilizations were watching humanity spread through the galaxy. Some of them probably thought humans were too primitive to survive long in space. Others might consider them a threat to be eliminated. But Jake was beginning to understand what made humans different from other species. It was not their technology, or their intelligence, or their physical capabilities. It was their absolute refusal to accept that anything was permanently impossible. "So I'm making a new promise," Jake said. "Not to avoid getting bogged down, but to never stop looking for ways to get unstuck. To never accept that a problem can't be solved just because nobody has solved it before." Lisa smiled. "That's a much better promise, Captain." "I agree," Tom said. "The old promise was about avoiding failure. The new one is about what to do when failure happens anyway." Rachel held up her communication tablet. "Speaking of promises, I just received a message from Olympus Mining Station. They're requesting that we take over the regular supply runs to their facility. Apparently, word is spreading about our escape from the sand pits, and they want a crew that can handle unexpected problems." Jake felt a chill of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by something else: anticipation. "What did you tell them?" "I told them we'd be honored to take the job," Rachel replied, "but that they should probably expect us to solve their problems in ways that nobody has tried before." Mike laughed. As long as they don't mind us occasionally building roads out of local materials. Over the next few hours, as the frontier made its way towards Ceres Station, Jake found himself thinking about the alien observers that had watched their escape. He had no proof they existed, but something told him that humanity's actions on Mars had been noted by intelligences far older and more advanced than his own species. He wondered what conclusions they had drawn. Did they see humans as a dangerous wild card that might upset the established order of the galaxy? Or did they recognize something valuable in a species that treated the impossible as merely difficult? Jake suspected that humanity's real test in space would not come from environmental hazards or technical challenges. It would come from other intelligent species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years and had very definite ideas about how new civilizations should behave. But if those aliens expected humans to follow established patterns of development and expansion, they were going to be disappointed. Humans had a talent for ignoring the rules and making up their own solutions as they went along. As if to prove his point, Lisa appeared at his side again with a new sketch on her tablet. "I've been thinking about the magnetic properties of that Martian sand," she said. "If we could synthesize similar materials in our manufacturing facilities, we might be able to create self-assembling construction components for space habitats." Jake, looked at her drawing of modular space station components that could automatically connect and reconfigure themselves. "Lisa, do you ever think about anything besides engineering?" "Not really," she admitted. "But that's what makes life interesting. There's always another problem to solve." Jake smiled and made a mental note to include Lisa's innovation proposals in his mission report. Not as examples of crew resourcefulness under pressure, but as the beginning of new technologies that could help humanity spread further and faster through the galaxy. The UES Frontier continued its journey towards Ceres, carrying a crew that had learned something important about themselves and their species. They had discovered that humans were not just survivors or explorers or problem solvers. They were the kind of people who could look at a death trap and see a construction project. The kind of people who could take the worst day of their lives and turn it into a learning experience. The kind of people who could promise to never give up and actually mean it. In the depths of space, ancient alien civilizations were beginning to take notice of this young species that refused to accept the limitations that had stopped so many others. Some of those civilizations were curious, others were concerned. But Jake Harrison and his crew were too busy planning their next supply run to worry about the opinions of aliens they had never met. They had work to do, problems to solve, and roads to build. And if those roads happened to be made of glass, melted sand, and pure human stubbornness, then that was just another day in the life of a species that had promised to never stop finding ways to get unstuck. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place.